Okay, thank you very much, Simon. And hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the webinar. I can see that we've got people here from an amazing array of countries. So the ones I've noted so far are the Ukraine, Greece, Switzerland, Australia, Brazil, the UK, China, South Korea, Belgium, and Turkey. So that's fantastic. I'm doing this webinar from Auckland in New Zealand, so I should probably say good evening, and good evening to the two colleagues across the ditch in Australia. But for the rest of you, I guess it's good morning or good afternoon. But wherever you are and whatever time it is, thank you very, very much for joining us, and I hope you get some interesting ideas from the webinar. So in the webinar, I'm looking at EAP, English for Academic Purposes learners, and pronunciation. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is last year I worked on some EAP materials, which I'll be showing you some examples of those. And when I came to do a little bit of research on EAP and pronunciation, I realized that in fact there's very, very little written about it. So it kind of, piqued my interest, I guess, and so I decided it was an area that I wanted to explore a little bit more in a little bit more detail. Hence the content of this webinar. So we're going to be looking at pronunciation in EAP, and obviously that suggests the broader area of oral communication, and looking at this concept of comprehensibility, which we'll look at in a bit more detail throughout the webinar. So what I'd like to focus on in the seminar, I'd like to look at the oral communication needs that EAP learners have, particularly when they move off an EAP program that we might teach and they actually sort of go into the real world, and they become undergraduates studying the subject that they want to study, be it geography, geology, business studies, physics, chemistry, whatever it is. I want to look at this point of comprehensibility and the relationship between that and a student's ability to communicate effectively. I'd like to look at what might be a possible pronunciation syllabus for EAP, and then we'll look at some materials and some methodology principles, if you like, associated with dealing with EAP and pronunciation. So I'd like to start with just a very simple task. I've taken a quote here from a study that was published last year from Shepard et al. And they did a survey at an American university, and they surveyed not EAP learners or undergraduate students, they surveyed faculty staff, so lecturers and tutors, people who actually teach undergraduate students, non-native speaker and native speaker, and they were questioned about their perception of the oral communication skills of international graduates. So what I'd like you to do is, you see I've put question marks by the percentage. So a very simple little task, see if you can guess what percentage of respondents expressed concern about the oral communication skills of international graduates. So have a think and then type in a number, see how you go. It's just to kind of get us underway. Okay, quite a range of scores. Okay, so some quite high, up as high as 90%. Okay, and one quite low, 25%. All right, there are quite a few who are kind of between, say, 70 and 80%. So this was what they found with the lecturers and tutors and academic staff that they spoke to. 73% of them expressed concern about the oral communication skills of international graduates. So that's quite interesting because it's quite high. So here is a quote from another study that was done by Shee, Harrison, and Henry. And in this study, what they did was try to find out how these non-native speaker students, when they moved on to undergraduate programs, how well they coped in the classroom with their native speakers peers. And what they found is that these non-native speaker undergraduates felt that they had little support from their classmates, particularly if it was difficult for them to understand each other. From the same study, what they indicated is, She et al., is that compared with native speakers, non-native speakers are less likely to express themselves appropriately. So this term is interesting because they're not saying they weren't accurate. They were saying that they weren't appropriate. And I'm going to tease that out a little bit as we go through the webinar. And therefore, they found it difficult for them to establish positive relationships with peers and professors. So this is quite striking to me because I don't know about you, but the time that you spend at university when you're an undergraduate is often a time when you establish friendships with other people that can last you for the rest of your life. So it was kind of a bit sad to read the results of this research indicating that these non-native speaker students, because of their oral communication skills, they found it difficult to establish these good relationships. So these quotes have been looking at oral communication in general, and clearly pronunciation has a clear part to play in that. So now I'd just like to look at some examples of tutor feedback that focus more specifically. These are tutor comments that focus more specifically on pronunciation. Now, these comments I got from the school that I work for here in Auckland, Languages International. And at my school, we have an EAP program, and there are assessed tasks on the program, and one of the assessed tasks is one of the oral tasks that students have to do is a presentation. And so I went back and looked at the feedback that tutors at my school had been giving our EAP learners, and here are some kind of example comments. So the first one, you were rushing through the findings, so explanations were not clear. So in effect, the learner here wasn't pausing enough. The second comment is looking at sounds, consonant sounds in particular, that weren't clear. The next one is looking at intonation or tone. And then the final one is referring to sentence stress. So in effect, looking at the quotes from the studies that are speaking more broadly about oral communication, then looking at this feedback that tutors at my school had been giving to EAP learners, it made me realize that oral communication and pronunciation are quite important in an EAP context. So pronunciation in particular, if we sort of focus on that on its own just for a moment, it is necessary to have reasonably good pronunciation to have good oral communication skills. It's necessary to actually help someone speak appropriately, and we'll look at what I mean by that in a little bit more detail, because I think it has a role to play in what I would call the sociolinguistic interpersonal role of language. So when two people are speaking to one another, how they actually communicate, not just in terms of the information that they're giving each other, but how they're perceived. What I mean by a sociolinguistic interpersonal role of language, it's to do with perception of the speaker and the interlocutor. Then I think pronunciation also becomes important. So this Shepherd et al. Was the very first study, the quote that we looked at, where you guessed the percentage. So this study was actually very, very interesting because what they did two things. First of all, they gave lecturers, tutors, academic staff who are not English language teachers. It's important to point that out. These people were maybe lecturers in business studies or some other topic like that, some other subject. They were given recordings of non-native speaker students, and they had to transcribe these recordings, write down what they understood, what they thought the student was saying. And that was a way of deciding whether they found the learners intelligible, that you could actually understand the words and the sentences that they were saying. But they also questioned these tutors and lecturers, the academic staff, on whether basically what their attitude was to the oral communication, whether they felt that they were comprehensible enough. And what they concluded, as you can see in this quote here, is the ones who had negative responses to the attitude questions, in other words, those who feel that the students had inadequate language proficiency, that was their attitude, judged the students to be less comprehensible, even as they were able to understand the words spoken. So what that means is that these lecturers were able to transcribe what the students were saying, they could write it down, but their perception of these students was that they didn't speak English very well, even though they could clearly understand them because they could transcribe what they were saying. So there's a little bit of a mismatch here. So this idea that someone's oral language means that people are going to have a certain perception to them. I mean, certainly in terms of their oral skills, um, but also I begin to wonder whether that actually has a trickle down into their perception of their written work as well. They did, obviously the study didn't look at that, but that's just something that I wondered when I was reading this particular study. Okay, so to try and um, get an idea of what we might need to focus on in terms of pronunciation, I think it's interesting to look at what kinds of oral communication that undergraduate students will need to navigate in an academic setting. So what I'd like to do is a kind of a brainstorming, if that's okay. If you could type into the chat any examples, any ideas of the kind of speaking that EAP learners are going to need to do once they graduate onto a program, an academic program, an undergraduate program, or maybe postgraduate program. So great. Tutorials, discussions, debates, interviews, talking to tutors, group discussions, interactions with tutors. Fantastic. That's a really good help desk, Skype meetings, thesis defense. Wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone. That's really good. So I'm now going to show you my list. I maybe haven't got all of your ideas, but I hope I've got most of them. Um, yeah, so giving presentations or seminars of some kind, participating in tutorials, discussions, debates, that kind of thing. A lot of you have mentioned meetings with lecturers, supervisors, etc. That would also include, someone mentioned defending your thesis. I would see that as part of that at a postgraduate level. Interaction with support staff, which is, as someone has said, like help desk, etc. Administrators, librarians, people like that. And also interaction with their peers. So the other students in their, on their course and their lectures, etc. And that interaction is obviously going to be of an academic nature, where they're discussing ideas that they're studying, but it could also be of a social nature. Another way of looking at oral communication is by looking at, say, discourse types or different functions of language. So undergraduates are going to have to do things like explain ideas and concepts, their research. In discussions, tutorial discussions, they're going to have to take turns, make suggestions, agree and disagree, negotiate consensus. Um, they will need to make requests, ask for permission, seek clarification. I mean, asking permission, for example, an extension for an assignment, they might have to go and see the lecturer or their supervisor. Seeking clarification, they might need to follow up from a lecture where they need to sort of find out exactly what the main point was. Um, they will need to ask for help. They will perhaps need to offer help, share ideas, making and responding to invitations, and gossiping. I think that a lot of undergraduates gossip. There are lots of, if you think of the more social dimension to university, that's something also maybe worth considering. So looking at your list and the list that I've got, you can see that there is a lot of oral communication that undergraduates need to engage in. So this suggests that, obviously on EAP programs, we do need to focus on reading and writing quite a bit. There are also significant oral communication needs. So when we look at the relationship between oral communication and pronunciation, I think that students should aim to be intelligible, appropriate in the kind of oral communication that they engage in, and sometimes they need to be interesting. If they're giving a presentation, they need to be interesting. So I'm going to tease out these ideas in a bit more detail as we go through, particularly looking at this relationship between being, say, just being intelligible, understood, but also being appropriate. So should we, in terms of dealing with pronunciation with EAP learners, should we be aiming to get them to sound like native speakers? I would say no. Most of the literature that you look at, not just in EAP, but also for most non-native speakers, when you're focusing on pronunciation, in most cases, there is no aim to make them sound like native speakers. And this quote of Murphy, I think, sums it up rather well. And that teachers like us realize that native-like phonological control is an unnecessary goal, so long as learners continue to progress towards relevant levels of intelligibility and comprehensibility. So in effect, learners, EAP learners, but also general English learners don't need to sound like native speakers. It's not necessary. That's not the aim here in focusing on pronunciation. So some of you may be aware of the idea of English as a lingua franca. So in effect, this is a way of looking at language, English, so that it is an effective way of communicating between two non-native speakers, so that they're able to communicate successfully and they can understand each other. So we can look at what is kind of core for English as a lingua franca in terms of grammar, vocabulary, but also in terms of pronunciation. So some research has been done, particularly by Jennifer Jenkins, on what might be considered core features of pronunciation for English as a lingua franca. So basically, what is critical for learners to get right so that they will be understood and they will understand each other. So I've listed 7 phonological features here, but one of them in fact is not considered core. So what I would like you to do, what I'd like you to type into the chat is decide which one of these 7 do you think is the one phonological feature that is not considered as being core, as being really important to be understood well. So just to go through them, number 1 is consonant sounds, most consonant sounds. Number 2, initial consonant clusters, where there are 2 consonants together. Number 3, the sound, as in bird and her. Number 4, the 2 th sounds, so th and th, the unvoiced and voiced th. Vowel length, so the difference, say, between e, which is long, and I, which is short. Nuclear stress, so where the main stress is in a sound group. And the division of stream into words. Okay, so we're getting quite a few quite a variety. 3 and 4 seem to be quite popular, and 7 also is fairly popular. I'll just wait a minute so that gives most people a time to reply. Okay, so as Jennifer Jenkins, she published a book about 17, 18 years ago, in which she looked at this, and she conducted extensive research in terms of determining what was critical for pronunciation in English as a lingua franca, and this is what she came up with. That number four, it's interesting, the TH sounds, which of course for a lot of learners are very, very difficult to say, the unvoiced and voiced TH, in fact, are not critical in terms of being understood. Whereas all of the other features are important. And it's interesting, number three is interesting because it's actually the only vowel sound which is considered problematic. So we're going to have another look at this in a moment. We'll come back to Jenkins' list, but just for now, what I'd like to do is look at these two terms that have been sort of floating around a little bit in the webinar so far, and have been referred to by different researchers, and I've referred to them as well. So number one, intelligibility. Number two, comprehensibility. So what I'd like you to do is match the two terms to the two definitions, A and B. What do you think? What do you think the match is? Okay, everyone's typing furiously. Okay, so thank you very much for your answers, everyone. That's great. It's wonderful to see such encouraging participation. So it could be argued that these two terms are subjective to some degree. So what I'm going to show you is the answer in terms of how they are perceived in a lot of the literature when you're looking at oral communication. So in the literature, number one matched definition A, so that was intelligibility. Number two, definition B. And this quote from Shepherd et al. In a way is indicative of what the perception is of these two terms. So intelligibility refers to the extent to which listeners can correctly identify the words they hear, often as measured by correct transcription. So basically, that's someone can understand you and actually transcribe what is being said. Comprehensibility, on the other hand, refers to the listener's perception of the ease or difficulty with which they can make out a speaker's meaning. So, taking this definition, I've teased out particularly the issue of comprehensibility. And to my mind, it has a slightly broader meaning than intelligibility. So comprehensibility has this emphasis on the idea of perceived meaning. So to my mind, that means that not only does the interlocutor understand the information, but they also understand the intention of the speaker. So did the speaker want to sound polite? Did the speaker want to sound interesting? So this is where this idea of appropriate communication that we've looked at earlier in the webinar comes back in. And this idea of interpersonal communication, effective interpersonal communication. And as I've mentioned, ideas of politeness and interest. And I think that this is a desirable objective for EAP learners, that we do want them to be not just intelligible, but by the same token, we also want them to be comprehensible so that their intended meanings are also picked up. So if they're doing an oral presentation, hopefully they're going to sound interesting because that could have an effect on their grade. So it's not just that the person listening to them can understand them, that they also are interesting at the same time. Okay, so bearing this in mind, what I would add in terms of EAP learners, what I would add to Jenkins' list is tone or intonation, because I think that this does have a role in terms of politeness, sounding polite, and sounding interesting. Okay, so I want to look at this a little bit because in the literature it is a little bit controversial. So this is a quote from Robin Walker, who has also done some really interesting work on English as a lingua franca and pronunciation. Now, he says that students who seem perfectly capable of imitating a tone that has been modeled for them in class are then unable to use the same tone appropriately when participating in communication tasks later. And I would agree with this. This is true. Often, if you kind of give students a very controlled oral practice activity, maybe drilling, but something that's quite targeted, they can also um, have problems when it comes to actually trying to practice that particular feature in a very sort of free activity. So I agree with them, but I would also make the point that the same actually happens with grammar. So often when you give students controlled oral practice of grammar and then you give them a communicative activity, often they don't use it in the same way. So I do wonder whether this problem is not just a problem associated with pronunciation. It could be really a problem associated with all language in second language classrooms. So he then goes on to say that even though they're not damaging to intelligibility in English as a lingua franca, the teaching of tones or intonation is not a good investment of class time. And I don't really agree with that, I have to say. I think there is some benefit in focusing on tone when we're looking at intonation, because I do think it is connected to this interpersonal function of pronunciation, of sounding polite and sounding interesting. So clearly, teaching tone does not affect intelligibility. Students will still be intelligible according to the definition that we've looked at previously. But I do wonder, does it affect comprehensibility if intended meanings are not conveyed to the interlocutor? So I think that when we're teaching EAP learners and focusing on pronunciation, we do need to take into consideration the fact that they might be perceived as being impolite when they're making a request to a librarian, or they might sound bored in a seminar discussion, or they might sound boring when they're giving an oral presentation. So I think that tone actually does have a role to play there. The other thing is that I think that if we look at tone or any phonological feature, I think it's a question really of developing what I would call practical awareness. So often students don't actually implement what we focus on immediately as soon as we've actually got them to notice it and practice it in a controlled way. But I think if we're consistent and sort of come back to things and get them to notice and explore a range of tone, that incrementally over time they can not become maybe fantastic speakers, but they can actually make a little bit of progress, and that may help them. And another way of looking at this whole issue of tone, it's interesting if you actually look at native speakers, because native speakers are in fact often boring. I think I saw someone typing in the chat before something about lecturers sounding boring, and they often do. So not all native speakers are good at giving oral presentations or delivering lectures. And there are these organizations, Trinity College London, the Royal Conservatory, London College of Music Examinations, which do speech and drama training. And I went online and had a look at their syllabuses, and they all have something along the lines of being more expressive, which in effect is a way of saying that tone is important, and being able to vary the tone and your intonation. So, I mean, this begs the question that if native speakers get this kind of training, why shouldn't non-native speakers? So that's a slightly different way of looking at it, but I think it is worth considering. So that focusing on this class, if we perhaps as EAP teachers, if we perceive it as training rather than teaching, and helping learners, that could be another way to look at it. So, which brings us to the point where let's look at how we can actually focus on pronunciation. So not only tone, but also other aspects of pronunciation when we're working with learners. So in terms of a kind of an overview of the kind of methodology, I think that broadly speaking, we want to provide a context for whatever phonological feature that we're looking at. I think we then want to highlight a specific feature, clarify or analyze the feature, work out what it is, what function it has, and then provide some kind of practice. This is broadly speaking. And I'm going to show you some example materials. These materials come from some worksheets that I worked on with my colleague Adrian Dove last year. And the good news is they are completely free. So if you go to the Cambridge English Empower website, and you can see the resources tab is highlighted there. And if you put academic skills into the search, that will give you a whole raft of EAP worksheets that focus on listening and speaking as well as reading and writing. But there are more listening and speaking worksheets than there are reading and writing worksheets. So we've actually placed an emphasis on the listening and speaking. So as I said, all you need to do is register, and these worksheets are completely free. There is a worksheet. There are teacher's notes with an answer key and ideas on how to teach. And there are also free audio files. So what I'm showing you tonight are just little excerpts from these worksheets, but if you want to go and have a look, you can go to the Empower website and download this stuff, and it is all completely and utterly free, something for nothing. Okay, so the first one, the first thing I'd like to look at is pausing and stress. So we're going to listen to a very short excerpt from a presentation. The presentation was quite long, so learners listen to it first of all and understand the presentation. It's focusing on the topic of child language, and the material is aimed at B1 level. And they then focus on this little excerpt that you can see in A, and they have to listen to that, just those two sentences, and underline the stresses and mark the pauses. So I'm, technology willing, I'm now going to play you the excerpt. So here we go. Okay, I hope you were able to hear that. So that's what learners do. Here are the answers. So these are the stresses, and the two vertical lines indicate the pauses that the speaker
Sorry, yeah, Craig, I was just going to interrupt you there.
So
I think
we'll
try it again now, and I think it should work again.
Yeah.
Please type in yes if you can hear it.
Since then, it's generally been understood that using sign language helps a child's first language development. However, more recently, research has suggested that this may not be the case at all.
Great. A lot more yeses this time, so that's good. You could hear it. So these, yeah, as I said, these are the answers here, and then we then move on to a task where the feature is clarified. And if you look at exercise C, the students have to look at these different options, the 5 different options, and decide why the speaker uses a lot of stresses and pauses, because as you probably will have noticed, there are quite a few pauses and there are quite a lot of stresses in those two sentences. And the reason for that, in fact, is choice 3 there. It's the very final part of the introduction of the presentation. So the speaker is kind of summing up and sort of reiterating and stressing the main points from the introduction. So so that's the kind of the analysis part. And then finally, the practice is actually just getting students to try and say those two sentences in pairs where they are trying to follow the stresses and the pauses that the speaker uses. I mean, one of the interesting things here, in terms of my own experience working with the AP learners, that it's not the stresses that are difficult for them, but it's often knowing when to pause. Often when I've been listening to oral presentations, it's like students are on a train and they kind of are rushing through it and they don't break it up into groups and sort of give the listeners a bit of a rest. Okay, so now we have a second feature. So this is an excerpt from a presentation yet again. The topic of the presentation was human diet, and it was also aimed at B1 plus level. And it's focusing on the feature of giving extra information. Now, what you're going to hear, you can see the 4 bullet point, the utterances that are bullet pointed. You're actually going to hear 4 different excerpts from the presentation, and you will hear language around the bullet pointed utterances. And what you need to do, or what the students need to do, is just listen for those little bits of language and decide if they're giving main information or extra information.
Today we're going to look at the way human diet has developed over the history of the human race, or rather the prehistory, I should say, because I'll be going back to our very early ancestors. But for others, such as these, the cost involved in obtaining them is much higher. We see a mixture of low-cost food, like shellfish, for example, and higher-cost food, and animals we use not only for meat, but also for dairy products as well, and cheese and so on.
Okay, so obviously the little utterances that you saw there are given a kind of a lower tone. They're like a kind of an aside. So they're giving extra information. And the students, in terms of analysis, the students look at these answers to the first question and decide whether the answers are true or false or not, as to what she's doing. Is she saying them more quietly? Is she saying them in a higher voice, etc.? So it's getting them to listen to the kind of tone she's using and the kind of pauses to provide the extra information. And the answers are here, indicating that she's dropping her voice, which signals that the information is less important. And then here again is an easy practice activity. There are examples that are similar to sorry, I just got a bizarre phone call, which I've cancelled. So these examples are similar to what's in the presentation, and the students practice trying to say the little bit that is either between the 2 dashes or between the commas with a lower tone. What's interesting about this particular feature, not only is it useful in terms of developing learners' awareness of doing this themselves in an oral presentation, but it also is interesting and useful for them in terms of being able to know about this extra information when they're listening for lectures that will help their listening skills. Okay, so now we come to the third and final example from the phonological features in the worksheets. So this one is focusing on tone to some extent, and this isn't from a presentation this time, it's from a tutorial discussion where there are 3 students trying to work out when they're going to meet up to prepare a presentation on genetics. So you're going to hear, in fact, 5 utterances. So you'll hear the first 3 examples under A, and then the 2 examples under D, I guess, so that'll work really well. And so again, the students are listening for stresses and tone and the differences, particularly with D, between the two examples. So I'll play this audio file.
I don't think that's a good idea.
I'm not sure about that.
I guess so. That'd work really well.
Okay, so moving on to look at the answers. So what's happening here is in the first three examples, again, there are a lot of stresses because basically they're disagreeing with each other, but they're trying to do it sort of carefully and a little bit politely. So they give extra emphasis and they slow down a little bit. And then the second two examples, the speaker was agreeing reluctantly, had a slightly lower tone. And in the second example, his tone was a little bit higher and his agreement is a little bit more enthusiastic. So that's highlighting the feature, getting students to understand what's going on. And then the practice here again is taking just the final two examples and getting students to use different tones with each other. And so they say, a student says it using one tone and their partner has to say whether it was polite or whether it was maybe not so polite, a little bit diffident and not so enthusiastic. So they do this together in pairs and just practice those utterances. So very, very simple activity. So to look at the kind of general principles here, clearly to focus on pronunciation, we want to start with a context of some kind, and it makes sense to actually have an EAP context, like a lecture or a presentation or a tutorial discussion. Ideally, we want to also provide a range of accents of fluent speakers of English. Now, the examples that I've showed you tonight have all been native speakers, but actually in the EAP, the Empower EAP materials that are online, across all of the lessons, because they go from B1 right up to C1, so we cover all of those levels. So there are a lot of lessons there that you can download. And in the recordings, there is a range of accents in both native speaker and non-native speaker accents. Highlighting the feature. Obviously, you want to actually focus on something that's relevant to your learners. If you're teaching in a monolingual situation, that makes life easier because their needs are all going to be similar. It's a little bit harder if you're teaching in a multilingual situation. We're going to look at an idea for that in a minute or two. Learners need to be able to hear and discriminate the phonological features. So you might, it's a good idea just to take a small excerpt, as you saw in the examples, and you may need to play it 2 or 3 times before learners can actually perceive what's going on phonologically. And this does provide very good practice in listening and decoding language, their bottom-up listening skills. So giving some kind of guided discovery task, as you saw there in the examples, with they had to decide whether statements were true or false, or tick the boxes as to what was going on with the feature. I also think it's a good idea if you can get students to think about the communicative purpose of the phonological feature. So why are we using a lower tone or a higher tone? Why is it important to pause? Why is it important to emphasize certain words? Develop that awareness. So practice, doing some kind of controlled practice. I appreciate that often, particularly controlled practice, can feel a little bit unnatural and uncomfortable. But I think this is an area, it's an opportunity in our classes where we can actually give students the possibility of exploring a particular phonological feature and develop practical awareness. But for me, the key issue for getting students to practice in that way, even if it feels a little bit unnatural, it is an opportunity for them to get feedback in a more supportive environment. Because when they leave our EAP classes and go on to undergraduate programs, they will get feedback on their pronunciation or their oral communication. But the kind of feedback they will get maybe is a grumpy librarian or an uncooperative classmate or a lecturer who doesn't really sort of understand their needs because their perception of the student's oral communication is negative in some ways. The other thing is that practice, getting students to actually practice, can help develop bottom-up listening skills. But as I said, there is an alternative way of dealing with pronunciation, and broadly speaking, I would call this recasting. So what you would do is get learners to do some kind of oral speaking activity, a presentation, a role play of some kind, and you might identify one or two problem areas in your as you monitor or as you listen, and highlight these, give learners feedback on them, then get them to practice them so that they in a controlled way, so they're doing them better, and then get them to actually redo the role play or maybe redo part of the presentation. So the benefit of this approach is that it does target and address learners' individual pronunciation needs. So the learner will often see this approach to dealing with pronunciation as being very relevant, because you've actually indicated, okay, you've got a particular problem with this, and this is what you need to do to fix it, and here's a way that we can do it. And certainly this approach does suit the kind of learning environment that I work in, which is a multilingual learning environment, where in my EAP class, I have got learners from maybe China, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, French Pacific, etc., where they have quite different phonological needs. So this way of recasting can help. Okay, so we've got to the end, more or less, and to sum up, the key points that I've been making is that EAP learners do need to develop oral communication skills. So yeah, we need to focus on reading and writing, but let's not forget speaking as well. And pronunciation is, I think, an important part of EAP oral communication. In doing this and focusing on phonology, we're not trying to turn them into native speakers. What we want to be able to do is try and make sure that they are comprehensible in an undergraduate setting. And remember, I perceive comprehensible as being not only is the information understood, but the speaker's intention is understood. So we can look at English as a lingua franca as a way of guiding us towards determining what the EAP pronunciation syllabus can be. And I think in terms of the methodology, obviously we need to focus on both receptive and productive skills. Learners won't be able to produce a phonological feature if they can't hear it. So we do need to get them to listen to it first of all. And then in terms of the methodology, apart from listening and speaking, also give the learners some awareness of what's going on here and what is the aim or the function of that phonological feature in terms of EAP. So this is kind of what when I was looking at EAP and pronunciation, these were the thoughts that occurred to me and that I'm sharing with you now. But this is not the only opportunity for you to get some input on English for academic purposes.
I would, yes,
Simon,
yes.
Would you like to talk
So firstly,
about
just very quickly, if you've got any questions, we have about 10 minutes left. Please, in the meantime, start typing those questions in now. I'd just initially like to say a big thanks to Craig for that, because looking at the comments in the chat box, I think it's definitely an area which a lot of people have a lot of interest in. So I thought it was a really good talk today. So if you have enjoyed today's talk and you want to hear more specifically about academic English, then I think we have just the thing for you. On the 30th of October and between the 30th and the 2nd of November, which is a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and Friday, we have an academic online conference run very much like today's webinar, and you can sign up for there are 2 talks every day on the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and the Friday, and these will be dealing, as it says on the slide there, with a variety of topics, things that are going on today, things that are very, very important. It says share your thoughts with like-minded people. So if this is something that you think you'd like to attend, please do. You don't have to go to every talk, or if you can't make a few talks, don't worry. Just sign up to the ones that you want to go to, and the address is at the bottom there. So it's cambridge.org/academic English conference, and you can take a screenshot or use your phone or just write it down in the old-fashioned way. So this is coming up, and And yeah, and there will be talks very similar to what Craig has been discussing today, all about academic English. Okay, so again, just in, do you want to say any more on that, Craig, or should we take some questions?
Cool. No. I just thought what I
Sure.
might do when you finish is flick to the next slide, because that's where the
It is, yeah. We'll come
references
back
are
to
in
this, I
case
guess,
people
if
want to
we
make a
if
note
go
of
to your
those. Yeah.
referencing.
So is that okay to do that now? Okay, cool. Okay. So these are everyone, these are the references, and maybe of particular interest are the two, the Shepherd and the She studies, from the Journal of English for Academic Purposes. I found them very interesting to read. This idea of tracking what happens to our EAP learners when they actually go on to EAP programs and what their oral communication needs are. Okay, so let's move on to maybe looking at some questions. So the first one I can see here is, do I think it's important to focus on linked speech for EAP? Yes, I do. And in fact, I mean, we didn't look at connected speech in the 3 examples tonight, but in the EAP worksheets, we do actually focus on connected speech, because I think, obviously, when we're talking about getting students to actually stress key words, in order to sort of make the difference between what's stressed and what's not stressed, for the not stressed part, students also need to be able to manipulate connected speech in that way. So yes, I certainly agree that it's important to focus on that as well, because I think stress and connected speech are kind of they're kind of so connected to each other, it's very difficult to kind of separate them out. I can also see the point about whether that's useful for listening, and that's the other thing with connected speech. Focusing on that as a phonological feature, and just getting little small stretches of language and getting learners to listen to that and try and find out whether there's linking or intrusion, weak forms, that kind of thing is very, very useful. And I
Okay,
think
thanks
that
very much.
can
We
help
had a
with
couple
their
of people, it
understanding.
was in the slide, the Jenkins list. A couple of people were wanting clarification on what number 7 meant, which was division of stream into words. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Okay, good. No, that's so in effect, what I would call that is, I mean, it's more easy just to call that knowing when to pause. So I'm doing it now. So basically, we kind of, when we're speaking, we tend to break things up into particular word groups. Now, as I think I mentioned, when I've been listening to some of my EAP learners here in Auckland giving oral presentations, that everything is just one continuous sort of I don't know, stream of language basically, and it's difficult to know when the learner's actually taking a breath in order to actually to continue speaking, and that makes it quite difficult to understand. And the reason is that I think that instinctively what a lot of people do is we break up our oral language. I feel as I'm doing it self-consciously at the moment because I'm talking about it, but we break things up in order to give the people who are listening to us a little rest for even if it's only maybe half a second, though, so that breaking it up. And often that is also, it's related to pausing, but it's also connected to stress as well. So we go stress, pause, stress, pause. So that's in that very first audio example that we listened to, there were quite a few pauses. They're not really long pauses, but it's just this breaking up the stream of sound in that way, because if you don't, it actually becomes very difficult to listen to and very
Excellent.
easy to lose track
Yeah,
of what
just a
the
comment there from
person is
Lucy. I have
saying.
the great advantage of teaching one-to-one, so I can really listen to my students, which is, clearly better. Yeah. Yeah. And there was another
That's
comment
ideal. Yeah,
above.
that's
Yeah, it's an
fantastic.
area that
Yeah,
gets overlooked.
very envious.
Ruler just above there. Thank you for this webinar. Pronunciation is an area of language that teachers and learners tend to neglect. And on that point, I'll just say again, as Craig mentioned, there were the free resources. Now these have an academic angle to them, and they're all on the Cambridge website in the Empower Resources section. So I think we had the link up there earlier. So please do check those out. There are a number of resources there. They've got all the audios that you need as well. Some of the audio files that we played, that Craig played today as well. So yeah, please check them out. And there's no catch; they are free.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions? I think that's virtually all we have time for.
I can see I can see one more. Do I think it's essential to introduce the phonemic chart? I can see one question. Yes, I do. I think it's useful if you can do that with learners. It's really useful if you want to give feedback when there are problems with sounds that maybe they're not quite getting right, particularly consonants, saying, I'm not hearing these two sounds, or we need to sort of put those two together. And the thing to do is teach it gradually. Don't try and teach the phonemic chart all at once. Over a course, over a period of 2 or 3 months, just do a couple of sounds a day, revise, come back to it. But it is an incredibly useful tool, not just for the teacher, but also for the learners, because obviously if they know the phonemic chart, it also gives them access to knowing how to say words, vocabulary in particular, when they're looking it up in a dictionary. But from our perspective, it's incredibly
lovely.
useful
I think that's
when giving
about
feedback
all we've
on
got time for.
pronunciation.
Again, big thank you to Craig for today's webinar. And don't forget to sign up it's on the screen now. Don't forget to sign up for the academic online conference, and that's coming up at the end of next month. And also, don't forget to check out the events page for further webinars like this, which is cambridge.org/ELT events. And a recording of today's webinar should be live on our blog and YouTube channel next week. I think we're putting a link up there. We've just put a link up to the blog if you want to go and visit that. And the certificate, you can download the certificate, which is another link that you'll see on the screen now. Do you want to say something there, Craig?
Okay, and could I just say thank you to everyone, and thank you for your participation. It's been really great. You've been a fantastic group.